Piece is sort of the introduction to this character. I wanted to try and show who this fox, magician is, and basically what his role is in the forest that he protects. I named the piece Forest Guardian because I want to make it clear that that's sort of what his job was, but I also wanted to try and show in the piece that it's a calm and sort of peaceful sort of guardian, less, martial or anything like that. Kind of loose story that I have going through all these pieces is that this guardian of the forest is called to defend his forest. So this is the Princess of Dreams, the Dream Princess, and it's her job to take care of the forest. She's the one who's actually in charge, and the fox works for her. So in my mind, she is sort of wishing for the fox to come and save the day, and so this is her trusty unicorn friend that she is confiding in. The fox can't defend the forest alone, so this is his friend, his companion, and also his apprentice. So in my head, the fox starts as a fox but becomes more human-like when he wears his cloak. But this is a human character that turns more animal-like when he wears his mask. So this is a kind of opposite of the fox character. The objects and things that he's holding are objects that he uses later in the story that are both to defend and to protect. And also he has birch trees with him, which is another big symbol that I used repeatedly throughout this series. Piece, now that we have our two protagonists together, they're going to go and defend the forest. So I sort of loosely wanted to have the threat be sort of a wintry, darker, colder threat, which I think was probably inspired by the fact that I painted this in November. So I wanted it to feel kind of like the forest is undergoing this change. The trees are dying, the grass is dead. And a big difference from the first piece, which is a lot more green and everything is still okay. So these two characters are going off into the woods to kind of go and fight this threat. So this is continuation of the last piece, that now that the characters have entered the woods, things are a little darker, they're a little bit more intense, and also there's snow creeping into the right-hand side of the painting, that as they go farther into the woods, they're going farther into the winter. This piece in my head takes place during the woods scenes, but it's sort of more internal, that the character is sort of perhaps questioning where they're going or why they're doing this or if they can manage to succeed on their mission. I wanted it to be a little bit more introspective and more of a portrait of who this character is. And also with the moss, kind of create a slight feeling of trepidation or fear or something, without it being actually a scary piece to look at, because things will be okay in the end. So now the characters have fully entered into winter, and I wanted this to feel like they're almost approaching their enemy but aren't quite there yet, but also that this is sort of the enemy calling on them. So the crows are a symbol for the winter witch that end up meeting in the next painting, and this is sort of her message message to the characters, that sort of like, you're being called, you're almost there. But again, I didn't want it to feel too frightening or too scary, because I feel like this is sort of a lighter, not too dark story, that I wanted to not feel like it was hopeless. So now we've met our villainess. This is the lady who's responsible for making everything winter. This is definitely inspired at least a little bit by Celtic mythology, with ravens and also with chrysanthemums being sort of the flower that's associated with winter. But also this is the painting where we kind of see what happens to the fox when he doesn't have his cloak, because he's had the cloak in every other painting, and in this one he loses it and he becomes a little bit more like an animal. So one of the differences in this painting from the other ones is the white markings on the fox usually go all the way to the back. It's just a stylistic thing that I do when I paint foxes, but that's not actually accurate to foxes. So in this painting I did more accurate markings on the fox, because I wanted him to feel more like an animal and also be fighting more like an animal, because in this is like the crisis moment for this character about whether or not he'll be able to defeat her. This painting I deliberately hopped past the battle. I wanted to keep things not too dark, and also especially because I knew people looking at these paintings wouldn't necessarily know the whole story going through my head. I didn't really want to have to detail out how this battle is won, but the battle is won, and as well as with the help of the cat friend. So this is kind of after the battle painting, and the feathers on the rock are sort of after the ravens have flown off and been scared away. And you know, now the fox has his cloak back and he's becoming a little bit more human and is clothed again. This is the celebration painting, that now that everything is better again, the battle is won, we are, you know, we've defeated the Winter Witch, everyone's here to celebrate. So we have both the fox and his cat friend, and we also have the dream princess again with her unicorn, and then we have a bunch of other people who have just joined in to celebrate this great victory. This painting is, to me, sort of what one of the other fox's roles is in this forest society, is that it's his job to help the seasons change. So now that winter is done and the dry grass is gone, now there's rebirth and renewal, and that's sort of part of his ceremony in my head, that's what he is doing in this painting, is bringing spring back. This is the final painting, and this is after the battle is won and spring is returned, and so these two characters finally get a well-deserved break, relaxing beneath an apple tree and fishing. So I actually began my career as a comic book artist, which is a little bit hard to believe for me now. So my style used to be actually pretty different and a lot older in a lot of ways, and I didn't use traditional media at all. I used almost entirely digital then. But then after that I actually worked as a graphic designer for a while, and that's where I started to really learn how to use color. After that, I've been an illustrator for the last couple of years, and I feel like at this point I kind of know what my style is. I found something that I like, and I know how to express myself better in this style, so it's something I think I'll stick with. For this show, I knew from the beginning that I wanted to do something with foxes and mythology and storytelling. So once I had that idea, I just sort of I started by designing the character, and then once I had the character, I sort of just thumbnailed a whole bunch of different ideas and decided to put those together into something I thought like was a cohesive story. I wanted to tell a story from beginning to end, but I also wanted the story to be kind of loose and open to interpretation because it'd be purely visual. So I always use the same exact process for all of my illustrations. I always start by thumbnailing my pieces first, usually just in my sketchbook like this. Here are the thumbnails for this show itself. I just think about what kind of general thing I want to do, gesture, and I don't focus too much on details at this stage. I find it easiest to always start with thumbnails. Even if it's for personal pieces, I always start with thumbnails. I don't start by sketching. Then I photograph this and I bring it into Photoshop. And I'll either clean up the thumbnail digitally or I'll clean it up by hand. So for this project I actually did it by hand because I worked a little bit differently this time than I normally do. Normally I always focus on the sketch first and then move to color roughs, but this time I actually really knew what I wanted to do color-wise. So I did all the color roughs first before I had a clean sketch. So just right on top of the thumbnail, I started color roughing. And so that's what this is right here. This is the color rough for one of the pieces from the show. And then what I did was I took some tracing paper and traced on top and cleaned up my sketch traditionally. Because I work in really solid shapes, I have to make sure I know where all my shapes are going to be before I paint. So I need to have a clean sketch. But as I said, I usually do this first and then the color rough, but on this one, I work the other way around and I changed the little kitty's head, so that's what that is up there. And I wrote a note to myself that I actually wanted this ribbon to be red instead of yellow. So sometimes I'll do that kind of change as well. After that, then I scan these and I take them back into Photoshop, print them out, transfer them to watercolor paper, and then paint the final painting. Because I like working in traditional media versus staring at a screen all day. It's just a personal preference of mine. But I also find it very meditative to work with real paint, to sort of just, you know, focus on this individual wash and not get worried about what's happening in the future, because you can't. You have to think about what you're doing right now. The other reason I work in watered down gouache versus watercolor, which is a question I get a lot, is because watercolor blends into itself. Here's some real watercolor, kind of as an example, that you can blend two colors into each other. Gouache isn't like that. Gouache will fill an entire shape cleanly. So for my personal style, where I work in a bunch of little shapes, that works really, really well for me. But that's the reason I use gouache instead of watercolor, but in general, I use traditional media just because I enjoy it. So I definitely spend a lot of time crafting. It's my favorite hobby outside of anything art related. So if I'm not painting or writing, I am making something. So I made everything I'm wearing today. And I also made, here's a little hat, I'm always knitting. So I think that it's influenced my work because I really understand how clothes are constructed. And I also really like textile design. So I spend a lot of time paying attention in real life to how fabrics work together, how textures work together, how colors work together. And I think that that's influenced how I approach art as well, especially how I clothe my characters and how that fabric moves on my characters, but also just in general how color goes together in paintings. I think the biggest inspiration for my work is my own childhood. Books that I enjoyed as a kid, like Wind in the Willows or Winnie the Pooh or Beatrix Potter, or other anthropomorphized animals and clothes have always appealed to me as a kid. So I think that when I'm painting for children, I tend to paint things that I myself liked a lot as a child, especially things like that. So I haven't actually come across a lot of fox stories in mythology. Like I read tons of mythology from lots of different cultures. I really am interested in it. I know that there are some fox stories. I've seen some in Japan, but I've not seen a whole lot of fox stories. But I actually am kind of working on writing some.